Hi there, my name is Kathleen and I'm a registered psychologist. I like making videos that help psychology students. My YouTube channel also centers around things like study, health, and psychology, so if you'd find any of that interesting, then please come and check out that space. Back in November 2023, I did the National Psych exam. I did all my own study and preparation for it, and I passed on the first round. It was really hard to prepare for this exam. I felt kind of overwhelmed at the sheer amount of information out there, and I didn't know how to go about the study process. So I've developed this short National Psych exam curriculum-based series, helping you get a better sense of the NPE curriculum and how to formulate your own study plan so that you feel a little bit more confident. In this particular video, we'll be doing a deep dive into the ethics section to help you work out an effective study strategy for this part of the exam. I also want to mention too that a lot of time, effort, and money has gone into creating this video series to help provisional psychologists. So if you want to show your support, some easy ways you can do this is by giving this video a like, leaving a comment down below, and also watching this video to the end to help boost it into the internet. Another thing that you can do too is there are 3 dots down below. If you click on that, there's a little heart that says thanks if you'd like to make a small donation. I do all of this in my own time. I really enjoy it, and it would help a lot if you could do one of those things just to help make this more sustainable. It would mean the world to me. Finally, I also want to let you know I'm currently growing on Instagram and TikTok, and on those platforms I'm sharing motivational content for psychology students and also like what life is like working as a psychologist, along with books I'm reading or podcasts that I'm finding interesting, things like that. So if you'd find that interesting, come and check out those spaces, come and say hi. That would also mean a lot to me as well. With the introduction out of the way, let's get into the overview of today's video. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the NPE curriculum for the ethics section, some of the resources that I recommend having include the NPE textbook by Pelling and Burton, also Gamble and Boyle's Ethical Practice in Applied Psychology, and of course the APS Code of Ethics. If we now pull up the NPE curriculum and have a quick bird's eye view of the content, you can see that for the ethics section, it's kind of confusing. I found it was quite broad. To be honest, when I got to this part, I didn't really know where to begin. So just to make my first point, there's 3 parts to the ethics section. So we've got legal issues, ethical issues, and professional issues. So in terms of this video and how it's structured, it's going to have 2 parts to it. So in the first part, we're going to look at the legal, ethical, and professional issues. We're going to decode this in the curriculum, work out what this means to help you develop your study plan. And then in the second part, we're going to do a practical exercise. We're going to look at some NPE practice exam questions that I have developed myself just to get a bit of an idea of what the exam could be like a flavor of the exam, to help you work out a little bit more about how you go about your study, what your study process could look like, to give you a bit of a practical idea. And finally, before we get into this, one more thing I want to say is that I found with the ethics section, with my study for this, I wasn't so much memorizing concepts or trying to learn things off by heart. It was more about having a good practical sense about what I would do as a psychologist in certain ethical dilemmas. All right, part 1, let's talk about those 3 sections in the curriculum. We scroll down to the ethics section. The first part, legal issues. The first dot point is knowledge and application of relevant legislation, including the health practitioner regulation, national law, and the standards, codes, guidelines, and policies of the board. Blah, 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 blah. It's a bit of a mouthful. What does that actually mean? What do we need to study for that? Those were the questions going through my head when I looked at it for the first time. I was like, what? Basically, it's referring to the board that regulates all health professions like psychology. And I started to get a sense of what to maybe consider for study with this dot point when I looked at the NPE textbook by Pelling and Burton. So in their ethics section, they begin by talking a little bit about APRA, and they lay out a little bit about the legislation, the board's standards, the board's policies, and the board's guidelines. So as a bit of a starting point, what I did to get the ball rolling with my study was I pulled up my NPE study planner and I just plugged in some headings for APRA's standards, policies, and guidelines. I made a few toggles for the sections that the NPE textbook highlighted, because I assumed that was perhaps the most relevant information to go over. Something interesting that you can also take note of too is that in the APRA reading list, they have a link to APRA's website, which has the national law and law pertaining to all the states and territories. So you could look into that as well if you want. However, the tricky thing with it is it's quite technical. Like, you can read it, but for me, I don't absorb it. So I didn't really find it too helpful to look at that, to be very honest. I found the textbook a good starting point to take some notes. And for things that I just wanted to have a little bit more of an idea of, I took a few notes, like CBD, continuing professional development. I took note that, of course, as a registered psychologist, I need to have a minimum of 30 hours CPD annually. And 10 of these hours needs to be via peer consultation. And I need to maintain my CPD portfolio for up to 5 years. I felt like that was really relevant information to keep in mind. And of course, the MPE textbook highlighted that. And I wasn't really trying to memorize this information. I was just trying to take some notes and condense it in a way that I could easily read and go over in my study system on Notion. And then underneath that first dot point, there's another dot point. It basically says, also know the relevant sections of national, state, and territory legislation and principles of best practice relating to a bunch of different topics. When I first looked at this, I went to the MPE textbook to kind of cross-check and see what they said. And they basically just repeated it, and then they said, do your own research. Like, there's some material from the board's recommended reading list. Go and figure it out yourself for what things to learn for all these different issues. And I guess I just felt a little bit frustrated by that because I didn't really know where to begin. There's a lot to cover here, and I had no idea what sort of things to learn. So how I went about it was I plugged all of these issues into my study planner. And then what I did was I used Gamble and Boyle's ethical practice book to help me make sense of this. I used it to help understand these issues in more detail. So let's have a quick look at an example together with one of these issues, and I'll show you how I actually went about studying for this. If we have a look at children and adolescent issues, confidentiality, competency to consent, on the Gillick mature minor principle. So in my job, I only work with adults. So I knew I was going to need to do a little bit of extra preparation around this. So let's focus on this as an example. If I pull up the Ethical Practice in Applied Psychology textbook, type in mature minor. This was something that I spent a bit of time going over. And basically what I learned with this section, that when it comes to working with young people, who you consider the client isn't necessarily the child that you're working with. So I learned that when you're working with children who are of the ages between 0 to 8, the client is considered the guardian. They're the person who gives their informed consent, who you talk about the progress with, who you talk about the sessions with. They're the person that you're sort of reporting back to. When it comes to working with children that are a bit older, between the age of 8 and 14, there's a little bit more negotiation. So they might have a little bit more say in what stays private in the session and perhaps what the parent should know. For people 14 plus, we have the Gillick's principle, the mature minor principle, where a person who is under 18 can make an informed decision about giving consent to treatment or psychological assessment. So I learned that typically psychologists assess a young person's level of maturity and evaluate whether or not they can give fully informed consent and just work with this person without the involvement of the parents or the legal guardian. I also liked that down below they had case studies that gave me insight into issues that could come up when you're working with young people, to get a sense of how to go about getting informed consent, how to assess a mature minor, issues that could come up. So they really fleshed out different ethical dilemmas and gave you a lot of insight into how to handle it as a psychologist. And then after reading through the textbook and starting to get a better sense of these concepts and what to do, what not to do, I would then have a chat with a colleague once a week, and together we would come up with various ethical dilemmas relating to one of these legal issues. Like, with working with children, what do you do if you're working with a child who's 14 years of age and the parent wants you to work with the child and the child doesn't want to do therapy? How would you proceed? How would you handle this? We'd come up with ideas of how we'd go about resolving this using these resources as a bit of a guide. And we just found this helpful for practically and critically thinking about this information. Okay, so if now we return to the MP curriculum and we scroll down to ethical issues, so knowledge and application of the ethical principles and standards in the codes endorsed by the board at the time and relevant ethical guidelines. Again, what does this actually mean? Basically what it's referring to is the code, the APS Code of Ethics. And in the MP textbook, they basically just summarize the APS Code of Ethics. Why read this when you could go to the source directly to your APS Code of Ethics and actually go through this as a primary source, which I think everyone should do. I read this several times throughout my internship. It's a very important resource to keep referring back to throughout your work as a psychologist. However, just reading this, I don't know about you, but I find that the information doesn't stick. So again, thankfully, the Gamble and Boyle book comes to our rescue. So what I did was, again, I made another section in my MP study planner. I plugged in the information from the APS Code of Ethics into here. I just outlined each principle, so I had a general idea of what it meant, and then I put my little toggles underneath. And then I used the Gamble and Boyle textbook to flesh out my understanding a bit more. You'll see that I didn't actually do this for every single part of the APS Code of Ethics. I didn't feel as though I needed to. I kind of just tried to flesh out my understanding of things that I wanted to brush up a bit more on. So if we have a look at an example of informed consent, let's just quickly go to the Gamble and Boyle textbook. Look up informed consent. You'll see that they actually have a whole section on informed consent. So let's take a moment just to unpack this, and I'll show you what I really like. So with learning more about informed consent, what I loved about this book was that it gave me a whole case study of how a psychologist would go about getting informed consent from a client, covering all the points pertaining to the APS Code of Ethics, and they'd have a section in here about this. And then they just flesh it out a little bit more. Like assisting people with a vision impairment or people from a different cultural background, how you might go about making sure informed consent was very clear. And it keeps going for all aspects of the APS Code of Ethics. And then at the very end, it has these reflection questions that you can also consider. The other thing I kind of want to mention and take a moment to reflect on too is that all these three things go hand in hand. And the way I thought of it was that I found ethical issues is, that's the guide, that's the APS Code of Ethics, that's how we respond to situations following the ethical guidelines. The legal issues are issues that can come up, and we have to consider this stuff in relation to the APS Code of Ethics, our guidebook. So the final part for the ethics section is professional issues, so understanding of models and approaches for continuing professional development. So again, I made headings for all of these points in my NP study planner down below here. To unpack this a little bit more and get a better sense of what this meant, I always started with my NP textbook. General professional conduct. They didn't give a lot of information. There was a few paragraphs. I found it helpful to read. There wasn't a lot to it. And when I actually went through these dot points, again, this is just me personally, but I found some of them were kind of self-explanatory, like developing and updating and enhancing knowledge through continuing education to maintain competence. That's something that I already had a general sense of. Like, it's important to stay up to date with the latest research because we're psychologists, we work to provide evidence-based support to people, so of course we should be staying up to date with the relevant literature. I understood that. Also things like professional self-management, including reflection, assessment, self-care. There wasn't really anything I felt like I needed to study with that. I understood what self-care meant. Like, I got that. So with professional issues, I guess the thing that I found myself doing was just pulling out things that I wanted to go into a little bit more detail or just do a little bit more research on. So as an example, something that I did decide to read up on a bit was maintaining proper professional boundaries. This was something that I wanted to have a better sense of. So as always, for the ethics section, I went to Gamble and Boyle's book, looked up boundaries. They have a whole section here on managing professional boundaries. So I felt like this was an important part to read in relation to professional issues, maintaining proper professional boundaries. And if we pull up that chapter, again, they have, it's so useful. Something that I found quite interesting when I was reading professional boundaries was boundary crossing and violation. So they talk about the difference between crossing a boundary versus a boundary violation. Crossing a boundary might be doing something that is not commonly accepted but could potentially benefit the client. Like doing an exposure exercise with the client outside of the therapy room by going to a sports game because the client has severe social anxiety, and this is a huge step for them as part of their exposure hierarchy. Whereas a boundary violation it's basically crossing that professional boundary that could potentially damage the client-psychologist therapeutic relationship, like perhaps attending a client's birthday party. So I took a couple of notes on that. Following a similar process as before, I just played around with ethical dilemmas, thinking about what I would do as a psychologist practically in that kind of situation, and it really helped. And again, just in this chapter of boundaries, they also refer to the APS Code of Ethics. They go through a range of different topics like power imbalance, non-exploitation of a client, and they give reflection questions at the very end. So I hope that information was a good starting point to get you thinking about the ethics section of the exam and how you want to go about studying for it. If you would like that extra layer of support, I do have a study planner for the NP available. It's basically a 10-week guide. It gives you a bit more structure to your study. I give suggestions for what you could study when, along with some reflection questions to consider. If you would find that resource useful, then check out the description down below in this video. Alright, so now let's dig into some ethics practice exam NPE questions to give you a bit of a flavor of what the exam could be like. Hopefully this helps with how to go about your study, what sort of information to consider. Remember as well, this is something I believe, the sooner you start doing practice exam questions, the more studying I think becomes easier because you have a better sense of what to maybe look out for, what the exam could be like. So if we look at my first question, you work as a registered psychologist in a small practice and find out that a colleague has recently returned after a long leave of absence. She mentions that she hasn't renewed her license yet, but is in the process of doing so and has only been seeing clients part-time until she gets this resolved. How should you proceed? A, you raise your concerns with your colleague about the ethics of her decision. B, consult the APS and discuss mandatory notification and what you should do. C, notify the psychology board of your colleague's actions. Or D, discuss the impact this decision has on the practice and that you'll need to notify the board if she does not stop working immediately until her registration is renewed. Okay, so the first thing I want to highlight is the question is, how should you proceed? In this scenario, your colleague is doing something that is completely unethical. She's practicing without a license that's renewed. So I think that gives reason to say that it's not A or D, where you approach your colleague first and talk about it with them. I don't think this is the next best step because this is a very serious issue. It affects you as a psychologist working for this practice. Ethically, you are obligated to report this. So B, you could consult the APS and discuss mandatory notification and figure out what to do. But I think in this situation where someone is clearly practicing, they don't have their license, it goes against the board, you have to notify the psychology board of your colleague's actions. So I would argue that it's C. And a handy piece of advice I found really helpful was learning that you always have to think about how you defend your decisions in court. So if something were to happen, how would I defend myself if I had done A, B, or D? I think the best next step to take, because she's already breaking the rules, is to notify the psychology board. Okay, so the next question, let's pretend you're a psychologist working with a 14-year-old boy who shares in session that he's experiencing bullying at school by someone he thought was his best friend. He says his parents don't know, but he worries about them finding out. He also says that he's had thoughts about hurting himself, stolen a kitchen knife, and hid it in his room. He says he feels completely alone and very sad. What is the next best step to take? So possible things that we could do: A, assess the boy for symptoms of depression. B. Complete a risk assessment and refer him to the local kids helpline. C. Talk to the boy about getting his consent to speak with the school about what's happening. D. Complete a risk assessment, find out the bully's name and report him to the school. Or E. Complete a risk assessment and tell the boy you need to talk to his parents about this. Again, in this question, we want to look at what is the next best step to take in this scenario. So it's a 14-year-old boy. He's taken active steps to obtain a kitchen knife and hide it in his room. He's worried about his parents finding out. Looking at the possible answers we could give, I'm going to cross off A and C straight away. Because this child is thinking about hurting himself, I think the priority should be completing a risk assessment. I think that is the next best step. So that eliminates two possible answers. We've got B, D, and E. So complete a risk assessment and refer him to the local kids helpline. I could do that. However, I still have a duty of care to this child. I don't want to palm that off to the local kids helpline. It's likely that this child is at high risk, like he's taken active steps to stealing a kitchen knife. I'm very concerned about his safety here. And the local kids helpline would likely want to follow up on this as well and talk to the parents. So that doesn't feel like the best response. I could complete a risk assessment, find out the bully's name and report him to the school. But again, it doesn't really address the child's risk and safety, immediate safety. And the school would likely want to get the parents involved as well, I'd assume. So if I look at E, complete a risk assessment and tell the boy you need to talk to his parents about this. Even though the boy doesn't want his parents to know what he's going through, we're concerned about his safety at this point. Like, this is the highest priority right now. And I think D and B would lead to the parents finding out anyway. So out of all the responses that I could give, I would argue that E is the next best step to take. All right, so that concludes our deep dive into the ethics section for the National Psychology exam curriculum. Hopefully you also have a better idea about how you could go ahead and tackle the study and what resources might be helpful with assisting you for this. And finally, I hope that this video helps you reflect on what the NPE exam questions could look like to help inform your study approach, what sort of ethical dilemmas you might want to consider and play around with, and come up with your own NPE questions or your own little scenarios that will help consolidate the knowledge in your head. If you could please give this video a like or leave a comment down below, and thank you for watching to the very end of this video. It really means a lot. Stay tuned for the video that's coming up next. I will see you there. Have an amazing day. I'll talk to you later. Bye!